Welcome to Everyday Economics, the podcast that helps you learn about the economic world happening around you every day. I'm your host, Chris Krug, CEO of the 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan Franklin News Foundation. Everyday Economics is a production of America's Talking Network. You can subscribe to all of our podcasts at americastalking.com. To support Everyday Economics, please make a tax-deductible charitable contribution by clicking a link in the show description. We are recording today's episode on Friday, May 24th. And joining me, as always, my friend and colleague, Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist. Dr. O, we try to get into data points as often as we can. Data, in and of itself can be objective. The data that we want to talk about today is a set that we have never spoken about on this podcast before. And this is the Survey of Consumer Expectations, which is produced, I believe, by the New York Fed, but inside of the Federal Reserve. Let's start with a quick 101. What is the Survey of Consumer Expectations, and how should we look at this?
Totally. It's a Survey of Consumer Expectations is a monthly survey of U.S. households. They basically ask people how much they expect to spend, how high they think inflation is going to be, their employment situations, and whether they're searching for a job.
Okay. So, all right. Well, let's get into the data. As you and I talked pre-show about what we wanted to, sort of go over today as we're taping a handful of everyday economics segments. This is one that you said we should do this. And I'm like, okay.
I think so. I mean, we've talked about the Survey of Consumer Finances, also produced by the New York Fed. Great, because that survey tells us about the credit scores and credit card auto loan delinquency rates being above where they were before the pandemic. But, the expectations are important, right? We want to know, if people expect prices to continue to increase very rapidly, they might go out and spend now to avoid paying a higher price in the future, right? Which means basically that could fuel inflation, right? So the Fed is really trying to make sure inflation expectations are anchored, meaning they are not rising because people think, hey, inflation is going to be higher in the future, so let me go and buy that new car today. House prices are going to be higher in the future, so let me go and buy a house today, right? Because I don't want to wait, because then waiting will be costly, right? And so it tells you a little bit about how people are feeling and what people are thinking is going to happen in the real economy. And that might actually tell us something about their behavior.
So let's take a look at the data as the data came in, and let's do an interpretation. Per the report, median one-year inflation expectations increased to 3.3% from 3.0%. I'm reading this directly off of the chart, which anybody can go and look up. This isn't like paywall data or anything like that. That's according to the April survey that just came out. They also increased from 2.8% to 2.6% at the 5-year ahead horizon, while decreasing to 2.8% from 2.9% at the 3-year horizon. Home price expectations ticked up to 3.3% after 7 consecutive months at 3.0%, reaching the highest level since July 2022. In the labor market, the average perceived likelihood of voluntary and involuntary job separation over the next 12 months decreased 1.2 percentage points to 19.4% and 0.6% to 15.1% respectively. So, that's pretty straightforward, but for those people that are trying to make sense of what that really means in the real world, what's your take on that?
Yeah, totally. 3 things, right? You started with inflation expectations. People expect inflation to be sticky. It's clearly households are not convinced that we'll be at a 2% inflation by the end of the year. And they don't even think we'll be there after 5 years. So people expect inflation to remain somewhat elevated. The other thing is, you mentioned is in the labor market, you talked about voluntary, right, layoffs, and involuntary, which is basically quits. Sorry, involuntary being layoffs, involuntary being quits, basically falling, right? So again, people are less likely to want to quit their jobs or leave their jobs, right? They're going to want to stay put. They think inflation is going to be higher. And then you mentioned the housing market. They think house prices will be higher, right? in the year to come, right? That they're going to be higher.
Well, let's take that in two parts. So we have talked on Everyday Economics about rents outpacing wages, and that becoming a greater pressure point in the market, or wages not keeping up with rents. On the expectation that something may happen to my job that's beyond my control, that seems to be the public sentiment as well as measured by this data.
Well, basically, this is saying that people expect that not to quit their jobs, right? They're not going to leave their jobs. They also expect layoffs to remain very low, in fact, to continue to fall. What that tells me is they don't expect hiring prospects to be very good out there, right? At the same time, they also expect inflation to remain high. And it's interesting because usually when inflation is expected to be elevated, people will try to negotiate higher wages, right? When they go into the labor market, right? Or if they quit or change jobs. But if nobody's quitting or changing jobs, you would expect wage growth to continue to ease, right? While at the same time, prices stay elevated. So real wages, real consumer spending, spending power would likely decrease. And so, yeah, I think this survey is basically saying people are not very optimistic about the future. Then you have, and it's confirmed by other surveys like this, like, if you look at the University of Michigan survey of consumers, you also learn that basically, right, inflation is high, inflation expectations are higher, consumer sentiment has fallen, right? So very much similar results across different surveys that are somewhat similar, right? Just looking at households, even though they're completely different, and the methodology might even be completely different. When you dig into the housing part, home prices likely to remain elevated and continue to grow, right? In fact, they expect home prices to accelerate. If you look at mortgage rates, expectations for mortgage rates, people expect mortgage rates to continue to increase, which I think is fascinating. Why do I think it's fascinating? Because as you know, I spent a lot of time looking at the housing data, at the housing market. I think it's fascinating because we saw a big surge of sellers coming in at the start of this year, right? After almost 2 years of no activity on the seller front, we started see a bunch of sellers coming back into the market. And the big question for me is like, could they be selling now after delaying a move because they don't expect mortgage rates to come down anytime soon? It's like, I think mortgage rates could be higher in the future, so I might as well make my move now rather than wait further, because if waiting could be costly, right? And I think that's fascinating. Again, this is just a survey, right? So it's like, hey, we asked a bunch of people what they thought, but I think it's still very interesting to kind of get a glimpse at or hints about how people are thinking about the economy today.
Yeah, I think it's going to be worthwhile for us, to follow the summer selling season and to see how much of this forward-looking sentiment actually comes to fruition. But I appreciate you explaining this, and thanks as always for making the complex easily digestible. For Orphe Divounguy, this has been Chris Krug. Subscribe to Everyday Economics and dozens of other quality podcasts at americastalking.com.
Freedom, individualism, limited government. On these issues, conservatives and libertarians generally agree. But where do we disagree? Check out the Future of Freedom podcast for civil, reasoned conversations about some of today's most pressing topics. It's not a debate. Our goal is to provide the best arguments from either side of an issue. Then you decide. It's the Future of Freedom podcast. Find it at americastalking.com or wherever you find your podcasts.